Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Lars Schall and I welcome you on behalf of Matterhorn Asset Management to the third part of a special interview series that I conduct with Mr. F. William Engdahl. Mr. Engdahl, is the control over the supply of energy resources for the economy ultimately the predominant factor for the whole social life?
If we go back to the end of the Second World War, at that point, up through the war in Europe, coal was the mainstay of the energy calculus in the economies of Europe. Home heating, industry, and so forth, power. And through the Marshall Plan aid, the role of the petroleum era was gradually introduced into Europe in the 1950s, the 60s. Agriculture was transformed into motorized agriculture across Europe, and motorized agriculture needs oil, petroleum. Then the automobile was introduced in a mass scale in Europe for the first time. So at that point, 7 companies dominated the world oil trade. They were called the Seven Sisters back in the 1960s. And those 7 companies, 2 of them were British, BP as it's called today, originally Anglo-Persian Oil Company, but British Petroleum, which was a state company, and the other one being Royal Dutch Shell, which is a Dutch-English combined company, but predominantly English. And the 5 American sisters were all part of the Rockefeller Group of companies, historically the Standard Oil Group. We had Exxon out of New York, we had Mobil Oil, Standard Oil Company of New York. We had Exxon, we had Mobil, we had Texaco, we had Chevron, and at that point we had Gulf Oil in Pittsburgh, the Mellon family. And those 7 companies created during the 50s, during the 60s, into the 70s in the first oil crisis, they created a domination over world economic growth through the conversion to the petroleum era. And by being able to control the price of that oil commodity, especially if we look after the oil shock of 1973, the oil embargo from OPEC against Rotterdam and against the United States for one-sidedly providing military support to Israel in the Yom Kippur War of October 1973. And after that, the price of oil increased by some 400%. And at that point, you had a global economic recession in terms of the physical real economic growth, especially in the developing world, in Africa, in Latin America, and you had a recession in the industrialized OECD countries because the energy price was so high. But on the other side of the equation, the banks, the oil banks of Wall Street and London were booming. Suddenly they were awash with dollar bills. They called them petrodollars. Henry Kissinger at the time called them petrodollars, because OPEC countries suddenly had 4 times as many dollars for their sale of oil on the world market as they have. Germany at that point, Willy Brandt tried to negotiate a bilateral trade with OPEC oil export countries to buy that oil for the Deutschmark, one of the stablest, solidest currencies in the world economy at that point. Washington intervened, not directly with Germany, but they went to Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, sent the Assistant Treasury Secretary, Jack Bennett. And I detail this in one of my books called A Century of War, Anglo-American Oil Politics. And they went to Riyadh and essentially told the Saudi royal family, we'll deliver you the weapons that you need to build up a strong Saudi military presence, but we demand one thing in return. You make sure that OPEC oil exporting countries sell that oil in one and only one currency, the US dollar, no matter how up or down the value of the dollar goes in relation to other currencies like the Deutschmark. And that iron fist rule is held more or less up until this day. The only exception for a brief period was when Saddam Hussein denominated oil sales to the French oil company, state oil company, in euros. And shortly after that, Saddam Hussein was no longer there to do that. So oil as a governor of world economic growth and world social life has, especially since 1945, played an enormously central role. Certainly in 1973, the 400% rise in the price of oil, and again in 1979, plunged especially the US economy into the deepest recession since the end of World War II. Today, because of the artificial life support that the Fed has injected into the Wall Street banking system since 2007, you've had a slightly different phenomenon than a pure energy-driven recession. In 2008, the Wall Street banks, I think the motivation was they were desperately looking for new, quick profit centers for their balance sheets to get rid of the toxic waste from the real estate bubble that had collapsed. They created a bubble in food and also in oil derivatives. And that jacked the price of oil above $147 a barrel briefly in the summer of 2008, and the price of grain was just going through the roof. Countries were hoarding rice suddenly and so forth. Part of that was driven, ironically, by energy, because the Bush administration had offered huge incentives to farmers in America to grow corn and ethanol products for biofuel. Not because George W. Bush was a friend of the Green Movement suddenly, quite far from it. He couldn't give a tinker's damn for that. But this was a move that was supported by BP, by Exxon Mobil and the big oil companies, because they knew that if you make the price of grain pegged to the price of oil, you can have a huge influence by taking 40% of the corn harvest of the biggest export country for corn off of the market and into production of fuel substitute. You're going to have a de facto explosion in the price of grain, which is precisely what happened. I predicted that a year before it happened because it was so obvious. So that brief period in 2008 was a very special case, I think, in that. But the economy, the real economy, and the price of energy and the price of real food, precisely the two things that have been stripped out of the consumer price index by the U.S. Fed since the days of Nixon, when Nixon said, "Can't you find a way to get these embarrassing inflation stats off of the front page of the newspapers so I look like I'm doing something positive for the economy?" And his pal at the Federal Reserve, Arthur Burns, back then, commissioned a young economist at the Fed who later became a leading economist at Morgan Stanley, and he told the story himself, to find a way to strip out oil or energy and food products from the consumer price index. So the two most important essentials for consumer prices, people can't live in the United States without automobiles. They can't get to work because of the destruction of public transportation largely after the war. And of course you can't get to work unless you have something in your stomach called food. So when you strip those out, then you can play all sorts of games with inflation numbers.
Yeah. In the 1990s you wrote one of the best books on the oil industry, A Century of War. You updated it then in the 2000s, and now you have written a new book. Why have you written this new book?
Well, information has come to me since I wrote A Century of War. The new book is called Myths, Lies, and Oil Wars. And namely that the whole, what emerged around the time actually of the Iraq War, the Operation Shock and Awe that the Bush administration launched in 2003 to invade and occupy Iraq, ostensibly looking for Osama bin Laden, we're supposed to believe, I guess, although he was holed up in Afghanistan in some cave somewhere, apparently. The Iraq invasion almost didn't make sense unless you accepted that the West believed, and the U.S. government believed, Dick Cheney among them, the former head of Halliburton, the biggest oil services company in the world, who should have this data from all countries because they do the surveys, the geological surveys, seismic and other. that the world was in a peak of its oil production and would begin a decline like the classic Gaussian bell-shaped curve. For a while, I found that the only convincing explanation why Washington, the Bush-Cheney administration, would risk alienating its most important NATO allies in a one-sided declaration of war that wasn't supported like it was when Bush's father declared war against Iraq to get them out of Kuwait in '91. So I briefly thought that this might offer an explanation that the physical reservoirs of oil, the known giant fields and so forth, were actually beginning to decline their production rates. Then the more I investigated, I went to conferences where prominent spokesmen for the peak oil theory were present and giving their arguments, and what I found was that all of their arguments were based on oil being a fossil fuel. And then some scientists, friends of mine, sent me certain scientific papers that had been generated out of Russian scientific circles during the Cold War. And they presented an entirely different theory of the origins, the genesis of hydrocarbons, not just oil. Hydrocarbons include oil, gas, coal, tar sands, shale gas, shale oil, and so forth. So it's a quite large spectrum.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about the scientific work that was done first in the Soviet Union and then in Russia?
Mm-hmm. I'm in touch with some of the leading scientists, Russian scientists who have been involved in this work for decades. It largely is unknown in the West for two reasons. One, during the Cold War, there was, of course, top classified security blanket put on any of this research because it was done in institutes of the Academy of Science, geological institutes, and so they were also doing research in deep earth underground nuclear explosions. So all of this was shrouded in Cold War secrecy. The Russians were given the order back in the 1950s to come up with a solution to make Russia, or the Soviet Union, energy independent from the West, because Stalin at that time saw that this was going to be a very challenging thing to maintain Soviet independence in the face of the creation of NATO and so forth after 1948. So they looked at the origins of petroleum in a rigorous scientific way, and they looked at the literature in Western geological textbooks and so forth, and they found nowhere rigorous scientific proof of the genesis of hydrocarbons, the genesis of oil and gas. It was postulated as simply a gospel truth, like the virgin birth perhaps, a gospel truth in American universities and British universities, and then by extension throughout the Western world, that oil was a fossil fuel that somehow originated from dead dinosaur detritus, that somehow in some cases magically managed to find its way 20 kilometers under the surface of the earth to create pools of hydrocarbons. The more the Russians looked at that, the more they said this is patently absurd. This theory of fossil or biological origins of so much petroleum, so much, and the fossil crowd also claims coal because it's also a hydrocarbon. It's another form of hydrocarbon.
One author that is known here in the West as a writer about abiotic oil is Thomas Gold. However, you have to criticize him.
Well, the problem with Thomas Gold, he's passed away now. He was not a deep earth geophysicist. He was an astrophysicist who perhaps knew an awesome amount about the heavens and the stars and the planets, but he didn't understand basic geophysics. And he was fluent in Russia. He was an ambitious man, and he came across a few of the Russian language scientific papers of the abiotic Russian scientists or their scientific group, and drew on them. The Russians accused him later of plagiarizing their work, drew on them and put them together with some of his theories that impact craters from meteorites, such as in Sweden or the Caribbean, create the conditions for abiotic oil. And he wrote a book called The Deep Hot Biosphere. And he tested his theory with an exploration in a meteor crater in Siljan in Sweden. And it was a complete utter failure. The amounts of gas that were discovered there were wrong. Later, the Russians went back with a contract from the Swedish government and realized that every place Thomas Gold's team drilled was exactly where not to drill. He didn't understand the notion of migration channels, of tectonic blocks and so forth, the way the Russians had developed it over a course of 50 years now. So gold is often used to discredit the Russian scientific advance because, number one, the largest oil companies in the world, the last thing they want to hear is that China and other countries could find oil in places they never thought before to look, because the fossil theory says there is no source rock there, there's no sedimentary basin that's going to hold oil, so therefore don't bother looking.
Do the Russians, for example, in Siberia, find oil where they shouldn't find oil?
Well, the irony is, during the Cold War, and I have this from the Russians themselves, during the Cold War, the Soviet bureaucracy at the highest levels feared for their job, and they didn't dare trust a new theory, which this was. This was a revolution in geophysical thinking, the idea that oil is generated. Let me say a word about the genesis of oil that they discovered. Oil is generated deep in the core of the earth. It's a gigantic oven, if you want to imagine it. And through the enormous temperature and pressure, it's forced up through the granite mantle, which is the next layer going upward from the core out like a giant golf ball. It goes through fissures or small cracks in the mantle, and because of the force of energy, it tends to go in a straight line as efficiently as possible toward the surface of the earth until it meets a trap rock or a reservoir where its on upward journey is hindered. And there it accumulates as reservoirs of oil or gas. The interesting thing that the Russians discovered is every giant oil field in the world, every giant oil field without exception, is a self-replenishing field, because this oven, the core of the earth, is always on. You don't turn it off. It's always on. The earth is, imagine it as a giant balloon with layers of paint crust on top. Well, the balloon is expanding by millimeters per year, and that's why you have things like earthquakes in Haiti or in Turkey or in Iran. You have tsunamis that affect Japan and so forth, because the entire Pacific is this so-called ring of fire of volcanoes. That's an enormously tectonically active part of our planet. So the oil is being constantly generated, the gas is being constantly generated. We're not running out of oil, ironically, we're running into oil any place basically that we look for it. Offshore Brazil, the Mediterranean now is one of the hottest natural gas plays in the entire world, and it's changing the geopolitics of the Middle East.
Yeah. Can you tell our viewers some names of Russian scientists so that they are able to take a look at those scientific work?
Well, a lot of their papers have been printed by peer-reviewed scientific journals in the States and elsewhere. If people go to my book, Myths, Lies, and Oil Wars, I have a detailed bibliography of the most serious scientific papers, I think 10 or 15 papers, and that'll give ample evidence. And the experiments have been repeated in the laboratory under pressure and temperature conditions, which never has been done with so-called fossil fuel. You've never taken a dead dinosaur or a dead anything or a dead plant, algae, and transformed it under temperature and pressure into a hydrocarbon. That hasn't been done because it can't be done. So the experiments. Even the Carnegie Institution in Washington has conducted an experiment, and the Russians were invited in to consult on that because Carnegie didn't know quite what they were doing. So this is established. This is no theory anymore. This is established. The trick of the thing, and this I know from long discussions with the Russian scientists involved, the trick of the thing is to know where those migration channels lie. For example, the explosion, the sinking of the entire huge platform in the Gulf of Mexico, in the Caribbean, several years ago from BP, took place because unknowingly, in their greed to drill alone without a partner and discover another huge oil find, because they discovered one 7 miles away a couple of years before, they, without knowing it, tapped into one of these migration channels, and the force of that explosion, because they hit, the source of this tremendous pressure coming from deep within, literally blew this platform out of the universe.
Yeah. In the meantime, now there's this fracking hype, let's call it this way, in the US. What are your thoughts on this? Is this the new renaissance of the US as a superpower in energy?
Shortly answered, no. The fracking, to inject millions of gallons of water with chemicals added to it into shale rock formations, and then blasting the gas that's trapped in the interstices of the shale out and capturing it. Number one, it's a horrendous user of energy to get that in the first place, and number two, it's a horrendous user of water. Number three, if depending on the depth you're drilling at, and they do this through new techniques of horizontal drilling where you can make a right angle turn under the earth, you have to admire the sophistication of the mechanical side of this, but leaving that aside, what they find is that the rate of depletion of these trapped gases in the shale is so rapid, much more rapid than conventional gas, that the formations run dry within a matter of 2 to 3 years, and you have no gas anymore, but you've had to drill so many wells to keep the pressure up and keep extracting gas that it's a financial nightmare. The Wall Street investment banks were huge behind this fracking bubble, I call it, the fracking bubble initially, because that provided another way for Wall Street to get huge profit returns when the economy was otherwise dead in the water in the last 5-6 years. But so they've moved now because these oil companies like Chesapeake and others were under such pressure to produce the gas and get it on the market to pay down their leveraged loans from Wall Street, they collapsed the price of natural gas. So the same companies migrated over and began looking for oil trapped in the shale, called shale oil. And that's where the concentration is at the present. Indications are from well data, production data, that the shale oil, as with shale gas, depletes also very rapidly because it's trapped in a very specific rock formation. I think there are much more efficient ways to find oil and gas. Ironically, the shale oil and gas boom in America has gravely disproven the peak oil argument, and you hear relatively little about that anymore, except there's always a lag effect in scientific knowledge. So the German government and various EU institutions still haven't caught up with the latest developments, and they finally have accepted the idea that there's a peak oil, an absolute peak oil, and the resource is declining at a time when the opposite is being demonstrated by reality.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this was the third and last part of a special interview series that I have conducted with Mr. F. William Engdahl. I and Matterhorn Asset Management say thank you very much.